Hello, my name is Aaron Williams. I am a member of the Chicago Alumni Chapter, and I'm one of the co-authors, along with our grand historian Kevin Scott, on the sixth edition of the story of Kappa Psi. Today, I want to provide a brief overview of the history of the University of Chicago chapter, the Iota of Kappa Psi, and I'll provide also some basic overviews of some key initiates from that particular chapter. The Iota chapter was chartered on February 9th, 1918, which is 106 years ago this month. And the students at the University of Chicago had the same type of experiences that other Black students had, where Kappa had just chartered chapters, whether that was at Northwestern University or in Nebraska, University of Nebraska in Lincoln, or Iowa City with our Gamma chapter. Same type of challenges as far as housing, as far as acceptance, as far as support. And so they felt, just like at those young men at those chapters, that the fraternity could help facilitate advancement and support amongst themselves. The charter members of the Iota chapter include Edgar G. Brown. Brother Brown was the business manager after graduation from University of Chicago. He served as a business manager for much of the 20s for Kappa Psi Journal. He was also a labor leader, and he ran his own civil rights organization by the 1930s, 1940s, as so much so that he became an advisor for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during his term as president. And later, after the FDR's term as president ended with his death, Brother Brown had just remained as a very vocal and animated advocate of civil rights throughout the rest of his life. Next was Dr. Albert Johnston. And his claim to fame was there was a major motion picture movie called Lost Boundaries that was based on Dr. Johnston's life. Dr. Johnson was very fair-skinned, very fair-haired. His whole family, wife, children, all could so-called pass. And so Dr. Johnson, the film on Dr. Johnson, kind of focused on his challenges as far as advancement and the fact that he wasn't necessarily upfront about his ethnicity, so to speak. So I would recommend that old picture to view called Lost Boundaries, which is actually in black and white. And 3 minutes into the movie, you'll see where there's a fraternity house with the letters Kappa Psi on the facade of the building, if you're interested. Next were two judges. One was Wendell Green, who was a longtime friend and legal counsel or legal colleague of our past Grand Polemarch, Earl B. Dickerson, as well as Irving Mollison was also a charter initiate of the Iota chapter. And Brother Mollison ended up being one of the first, if not the first, Black federal judge in United States history. And two other charter initiates were Dr. George Cecil Lewis and attorney Nelson Willis. Both of these men became province polemarchs. Dr. Lewis was on the Grand Board of Directors, and then in the early 1950s, and Grand Polemarch Stud Green appointed him as North Central Province Polemarch. Unfortunately for Dr. Lewis, he passed away about 6 months into his term as the North Central Province Polemarch. And attorney Willis, Brother Willis, was a charter member of the Louisville, Kentucky Alumni Chapter, and he was the first province polemarch of what is now termed the South Central Province. For Iota chapter, you can divide the chapter into three different eras. The first era was from 1918 till about World War II. And the reason why I put it to this particular time frame was the membership was almost exclusively students from University of Chicago. For many of those years, Kappa Psi was the only D9 fraternity on the University of Chicago campus. All right. Some of the noteworthy events, probably the most noteworthy event during this particular time in the chapter was in the late 30s, the Iota chapter petitioned the Interfraternal Council, IFC, for a membership, which they were denied, and for various reasons. But there was some benefits for the chapter to be a member of IFC at the time. And this particular controversy was well publicized in journals as well as school newspapers on the University of Chicago campus. The second era of Iota chapter starts mainly in the early 1940s, around World War II. And this is when the chapter evolved into a citywide chapter. And along with the other undergraduate chapter in the Chicago city limits, Alpha Rho, the two chapters divided the schools between the two chapters. So if you went to this particular school, you were initiated to the fraternity through one chapter. If you went to another school on the other side of town, you were initiated in the other chapter. Both chapters operated basically as one. They had consolidated meetings, consolidated lines, consolidated smokers, so on and so forth. And this lasted until the 1950s with this. And so the one unique item as far as this particular chapter is concerned during the second era of Iota was they had a local rule, which was that the poll mark of the Iota chapter had to be a University of Chicago student, even though they may have had students from DePaul or Chicago Teachers College. For administration purposes, they had to have a poll mark that was a current University of Chicago student, whether that was a undergraduate or a graduate student at that particular institution. And during this time period, a couple of things of note. Both chapters were a resident of the famous Chicago alumni chapter on Ellis Street, and both of them operated out of that particular chapter house for many years during the 50s and 60s. Number two, the University of Chicago had a tradition of the fraternity singing, and Iota was always a active participant in the IFC Sing. And typically that was where fraternity members from all different fraternities would sing fraternity songs and school songs. And actually, the chapter ended up cutting an album of songs that were University of Chicago songs. All right. The third and final chapter of or era of this particular chapter is the current era we're in right now, which is one of inactivity. By the 1960s, the early 1960s, while the chapter membership was pretty strong, the membership of Chicago University of Chicago students, was increasingly decreasing. And it became no longer viable to have a chapter there if there was no interest from the chartering institution. And so this chapter, except for a couple of years in the late 1990s, has been inactive since John Kennedy was president. And the long and short of it is that at that particular institution, there's very little black male students there, and of the black students at that particular institution, there's very little, if any, interest and particularly sustaining interest to keep a chapter there. So at different times in the last preceding decades, the province and Chicago alumni have thought about what to do with Iota, but basically this chapter, very historic chapter in Kappa Psi, has been inactive since the late 1960s. Okay. Some noteworthy members of the chapter, and I'll end this video, is number one is J. Ernest Wilkins Jr. He was a 1938 initiate of the Iota chapter. He was a mathematical prodigy. He was accepted into the University of Chicago at 13 years old. And he was initiated into the fraternity when he was 14 years old, and had advanced degrees in mathematics before he turned 20. Dr. Wilkins was the second Grand Keeper of Records and Exchequer following his father. He served in that particular office for 5 years before stepping down. He was very noted for his being a professor and a scientist throughout his life. He was a mentor to numerous Black students, both male and female, in the fields of science and mathematics. One last note about Dr. Wilkins: if you go to if you watch the Oppenheimer film, you will see that he was represented in that film that came, I think, last year, 2023, because Dr. Wilkins worked on the Manhattan Project along with three or four other men, black men that were Kappas. Next is Truman Gibson, and Brother Gibson was initiated in the in the early 1930s. He was an undergraduate member of the Grand Board of Directors in the early 1930s. He was attorney post his graduation in law school. He was affiliated with the United States Army. He was, as far as a attorney, he was also very much a civil rights attorney. And by the late 1940s and 50s, Brother Gibson got involved with prize fighting as far as the network rights to televise boxing back in the 1950s and early 60s. Next is Richard Hudlin. And Richard Hudlin was initiated in the 1920s of the University of Chicago chapter, the Iota Kappa Psi. He was a tennis player and the first black captain of a Big Ten school team. Back in those days, in the 1920s and 30s, the University of Chicago was in what we now call the Big Ten Conference. His claim to fame: he was a longtime instructor at Sumner High in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was a tennis coach for countless black youths, both men and women. And his most famous pupil was Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe actually moved to St. Louis in his senior year and attended Sumner High and graduated from Sumner High. And during his time in St. Louis, under the tutelage of Coach Hudlin, he lived in the Hudlin household. And this was an attempt to improve Arthur Ashe's tennis game and provide better competition than what he was able to have in his hometown of Richmond, Virginia. And finally, the other individual I'd like to bring up as far as a famous initiate of the Iota chapter is Robert Ming. Robert Ming was a initiate in the early 1930s of the Iota chapter. He was a very influential civil rights attorney. He was a legal counsel for the NAACP for many years. He worked at Howard University. I think he was a dean for a minute. And he also defended Dr. King in one of Martin Luther King's trials that he had in the early 1960s. Bob Ming was on the vanguard of what we saw as far as black attorneys that rose to prominence in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. This included Thurgood Marshall and also included many other black attorneys, many of whom were Kappas, including Grandpa Mark Earl Dickerson, Lauren Miller, who did a lot of housing discrimination lawsuits, as well as George C. Hayes out of the Washington, D.C. alumni, and who's also a Laurel Wreath laureate, and another Laurel Wreath laureate in Leon Ransom. And all these, what my point is that Ming was on that group of very prominent black attorneys that challenged and made huge changes in the United States by challenging discrimination in the courtroom. Brother Ming was fairly active in the fraternity throughout most of his life. He was a very popular banquet speaker. And he was also chairman for many years for what they called the National Problems Committee, which in today's world you would say would be a public policy committee for the fraternity. And so he was very in tune with politics and very in tune with particular civil rights discrimination cases. So we talked about the Iota chapter, and for more information on the Iota chapter, please go to the Story of Kappa Psi, as well as there's an article from 2018 in the journal that was focused on the centennial celebration of the Iota chapter. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.